Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. Let the Games begin. The Tokyo Olympics are finally happening a year later than planned, but the question now is, will they be worth the wait? The Olympic flame will burn as ever, but there won't be any spectators to see it. Plus, protests continue. We'll be asking whether the Games should have been postponed for another year. And we'll be finding out just how more than 11,000 athletes are getting ready for an Olympics like no other. The Games of the 32nd Olympiad in Tokyo will finally get underway later this week, followed by the 16th Paralympic Games in August. But they will, of course, be Olympics and Paralympics like no other before them. Delayed by 12 months by the COVID pandemic, the Games will now go ahead, but in central Tokyo at least, without a single spectator there to cheer on the athletes. Ticket sales had already been sluggish, with fewer than 5 million sold even before the latest Tokyo State of Emergency announcement, more than 1 million fewer than at recent Games in Rio and Beijing, and over 3 million fewer than the record-breaking London Games of 2012. And all that has led to concern from the international and domestic sponsors of the Games that they may not get returns on the billions of dollars it's cost them to have their brands associated with the biggest sporting event on the planet. And for the more than 11,000 athletes expected to compete, it's going to be a very different experience. Where usually they can use the crowd to propel them to greater levels of performance, this time, the usual deafening roar of support will be entirely absent. With fewer than 20% of the Japanese population currently having had a single vaccine dose, there is real concern the Games could lead to a huge spike in COVID cases across the country. One poll earlier this year suggested more than 80% of Japanese people thought the Games should be cancelled. Cancellation would cost Japan around $16.5 billion, a huge sum, but one which critics claim could be dwarfed by the costs associated with a nationwide post-Olympics state of emergency. But others argue that what the world really needs in these very difficult times is to see the very best athletes from around the world coming together to perform at their peak. The strict measures in place to keep athletes safe is simply the price we have to pay if the Olympics are to happen in the midst of a global pandemic. Perhaps it's just the right time for us all to remember we need to strive to be, as the Olympic motto puts it, faster, higher and stronger. So just what kind of Games can we really expect? Let's speak now to Tatsuo Ogura, the International Communications Project Director for Tokyo 2020. You must be getting very excited about what's to come.
Absolutely, we are excited to have the Games. We waited for another year because this game, Tokyo 2020 game, has been postponed last year, as you know. This is an unprecedented situation for everybody in the world. For us, that was really challenging under this circumstance, and also, no other organizing committee experienced postponed Games. So we are excited to host the Games finally.
We now know that Tokyo will be under a state of emergency for the entire Olympic Games. Did that decision make you think, well, perhaps we should further postpone the Games?
The situation are changing all the time. Of course, last year on March 24th, 2020, in between the discussion with stakeholders, the postponement was decided. But ever since, we have been preparing for the Games start on 23rd of July 2021, and we have been working on the COVID-19 countermeasures with all stakeholders to the Games, including medical experts. So we got a lot of advices and supports from those medical experts and also many different stakeholders. And we published the guideline for COVID-19 called Playbooks, which is dedicated to those different stakeholders. So we have a tailor-made playbook for each stakeholder, and we are making sure to communicate those guidelines to be digested by each stakeholder.
Yes, I mean, you've obviously made huge preparations and gone to a lot of trouble for consultation and create guidelines. Nevertheless, the Japanese emperor is one person who said he is extremely worried about the possible outbreak of COVID the Olympics could cause. The emperor said, given the public's worries, he appears concerned about whether the event would cause infections to spread. So tell us, what measures do you have in place to ensure that athletes around the world are in fact kept safe?
So under the playbooks for athletes and team officials, we have set a lot of guidelines, which are almost like 60, 70 pages of this playbook. We determined that the
60
guidelines...
or 70 pages of guidelines only works if people read the 60 or 70 pages, which I doubt is going to happen, to be honest, and if they abide by those guidelines. So how are you going to enforce those guidelines?
We asked to all the delegation to assign COVID-19 liaison officer for each delegation, so that this person will be in charge to collect the activity plan for all of their members, and also they will be in charge for monitoring the health condition for all of their delegation members during their stay. So for athletes, we will have we ask to the teams, NOCs and PCs to have a screening test twice before entering Japan, and also entering Japan at the airport. We do have testing as well, and also when they're coming into the village, we will have daily based testing for athletes to make sure we have the health monitoring daily base. And if there is a case of positive, then the screening test will be tested daily base. And if somebody tested positive, we do have another test, PCR test. Then if determined the positive case, before the second test, this person will be isolated. And if the second test is positive, then we will have a separate, the medical place for these tested positive case people.
Well, what message do you think Tokyo is hoping to send to the rest of the world with these games?
So this is the first ever games to be postponed 1 year. It's really unprecedented situation for everybody in the world, and everybody has been in the tough situation with COVID-19 pandemic. However, we do believe we can show the power of sport through Olympic and Paralympic Games under the circumstance. And when it comes to the Olympic and Paralympic Games, we believe the top athletes from all over the world showing their the best performance possible to the world. And as a games organizer, we expect to show these, their excitement and also the, their passion, their emotion, and those emotion unites the world. That's our games motto, united by emotion. So we believe we can show this, emotion and passion to the world through the games.
Are you passionate about the games? And which events are you looking forward to?
There are many sport events. For Olympic Games, we have 33 sports and 22 sports for Paralympic Games. But especially, we will have some new sports making debut at the Olympic Tokyo 2020 Games. For example, skateboarding, surfing, sport climbing, those sports are newly added to the Tokyo 2020 Games. So I think that's going to be showcasing new direction of the Olympic Games. And also me personally, I used to work for the swimming team. So personally, I'm really excited to see the sport of swimming as well.
Yeah, me too. Tatsuo Ogura, many thanks to you for joining us on the agenda.
Thank you very much.
So that's the view of the organisers, but what about the people of Tokyo, indeed Japan? Here to give us an insight into how the Olympics is going down with the general population is Dan Olowitz, sports writer at the Japan Times. Dan, the mood, what's it like in Tokyo?
Apprehensive, nervous, we're exhausted. I think that in general, a lot of people want to get these Olympics over and done with as little incidents as possible. It's been a very difficult road to get here. These are not the games we expected, not the ones we had hoped for, not the ones we planned for, but they're here. And I think that we all just want to get to the finish line. That's the goal.
And disappointment, I would expect, because there won't be any fans to enjoy them in person.
Absolutely. I think that this was going to be a spectacle. This was everything that Japan and that Tokyo had planned for over the last decade. If you look at the infrastructure improvements to the capital, everything that went into being able to welcome hundreds of thousands of foreign fans to Tokyo and have them enjoy everything it has to offer and everything Japan has to offer. You look at how successful the 2019 Rugby World Cup was and how that was sort of the precursor. We thought that was a dress rehearsal for the Olympics when it turns out that those 240,000 or so fans who came from overseas, they were really lucky because they're the last ones who got to enjoy things pre-pandemic.
And the Japanese are always very organised and a very proud people. But polls in Japan, as you know from the Japan Times, have shown many wanted the Games to be cancelled. Was that your feeling too?
The polling has been complicated, especially if you look at how the goalposts have shifted over the last few months, with postponement no longer an option, asking respondents if they want the games to be held with fans or without fans. So the goalposts have shifted, expectations have been lowered, and I think that the public realizes at this point, with less than 2 weeks to go, I guess a week to go at this point, that they are happening, and I think everyone just wants them to happen safely, and that's now the biggest concern.
And introducing a state of emergency can't have helped.
Well, this is our fourth state of emergency here in Tokyo. We've gotten used to it. A state of emergency in Japan, it isn't as strict as the lockdowns experienced in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and some other countries around the world. At this point, the only real restriction is that bars and restaurants have to close at 8 p.m. and they aren't allowed to serve alcohol. But museums are open, theaters are open, shopping malls and department stores are open. Life is somewhat similar to as it was before COVID, not quite as crowded, certainly not nearly as many tourists, but everyone is wearing their masks and getting on with their day. So the debate here has been, well, if you can have spectators at football games, at baseball games, at the sumo tournament that's ongoing, why can't you have fans at the Olympics? And a lot of what you're seeing is these last minute decisions to eliminate fans from the games, that has been sort of in response to public perception. So it is very complicated. And I think that the outsider view of what's happening in Japan doesn't always quite have all of the information that we do. And there is a perception issue, I feel.
A perception issue about what, Dan?
About how Japan has handled this pandemic and handled the Olympics compared to how other countries have handled large sporting events. If you look at how the European Championships had fans in stadiums around, I believe, 11 or 12 countries, and a lot of those have now sort of turned into these super spreader events. And yet, there hasn't been nearly as much backlash towards UEFA for hosting the Euros as there has been to Japan for hosting the Olympics. Now, obviously, that's a question of scale. You don't have 200 plus countries coming to the Euros. You only have 32, I believe it is. But it's different. I think that Japan is sometimes judged by a bit of a double standard. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been missteps. That's not to say that the government has gotten all of the pandemic response right. That's not to say that organizers have gotten everything right. But at this point, I think that the Olympics are doing the best with what they can, and I don't particularly think that any country in the world is in the best position to hold the Olympics, but of those countries, Japan is the most able to, if that makes sense.
Dan Olowitz, many thanks for joining us from Tokyo on The Agenda.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Still to come here on The Agenda, preparing a team for a pandemic games. We'll be speaking to the head of the British Olympic Association. Welcome back to The Agenda. More than 11,000 athletes are now heading towards Tokyo in readiness for the two biggest weeks of sport in the global calendar. So what does this Olympics really hold for them? And how have they been made ready for a pandemic games? I'm joined now by the president of the British Olympic Association, Hugh Robertson. Hugh, what kind of games are you expecting in Tokyo in these bizarre and different circumstances?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious to say that it's going to be a games like none other. The situation with the global pandemic dictates that. But then I think you have to remember that for the athletes and for those who's watching, it is all about the sport, and it is always about the sport. So for those athletes, yes, there are some additional requirements going into Tokyo around testing and all the rest of it. But once they get there, they will want to do what every single Olympic athlete before them from every country around the world has wanted to do, which is to win a gold medal, and that remains unchanged.
Obviously, you have to worry about keeping the British athletes, your delegation, and the people of Japan all safe. So what kind of special measures have you been taking, or will you be taking?
We've put in place the most rigorous testing regime possible. So it started actually way back a couple of months ago with the fact that we're pretty confident that all our athletes will be double vaccinated. So they have that precaution. They will then do tests 2 weeks out, 4 days out, 3 days out, and then a run of lateral flow tests. They will isolate as a team for 3 days on the way in. So we are absolutely doing everything we can to ensure not only that our athletes turn up at the start line in the best possible shape, but that they do so in a way that protects the host population.
It's also emerged, Hugh, that there are some athletes in the GB team that don't want to be vaccinated. What are you doing to address that? Can you force them to have the jab?
Well, it's tiny numbers is the first thing. I mean, we're probably going to have a team of of above 370, and it's small single-figure numbers, and we are doing everything we can to persuade them that it is in their interest and in their interests as Olympians traveling to a city like Tokyo to be vaccinated. So we will do everything we can to persuade them to have those vaccinations.
In terms of safety, would it have been better to cancel the Games or rather postpone the Games again until it's a safer time for the world?
Absolutely not, no. I think it was a sensible and rational decision to postpone them a year ago. I think if that were to happen again, these Games would drop out of the cycle. As I know personally as the Olympics minister here in London in 2012, a country goes through an enormous amount of preparation. So I think we sort of owe it to the Japanese people and to the country of Japan to turn up as long as they want to host us. And I am absolutely convinced that we can do that in a safe and secure way that allows our athletes to perform, that keeps the people of Japan safe, and actually shows the world how we can run an event of this style with traditional Japanese efficiency and all the other things for which Japan is famous, how we can run an event like this, and as I say, keep both athletes and the local population safe. And I say that, safe from the knowledge, I'm afraid, that I don't think this virus is, it's not going to be eliminated in the next 6 months or a year probably. And we're going to all have to learn to live with it, and learn to live with it in a way that allows us to return to some form of normality whilst keeping everybody as safe as possible. And I think the Olympic Games will be a terrific example of that.
On a purely sporting front, Team GB became the first country ever to increase its medal haul in the Games after hosting, taking, I think, second place in the table after the Rio Games in 2016. What are your expectations this year?
Uniquely difficult question to answer. I mean, it's a very good question, but a uniquely difficult one to answer. Because normally when you're looking at trying to predict medals, which frankly is a bit of a fool's game anyway, because they're decided by fractions of a second, normally what you do is you look at the competitive run up to the Games, you look at how your athletes have performed, you see how they perform under different types of pressure. None of that information, because the global sporting calendar has been decimated, none of that sort of information is available. So I think this may be the Games, and personally I'm much happier this way, where instead of getting hung up on medal targets or who came where and did what, we actually celebrate the individual sporting brilliance of the athletes, celebrate that and worry rather less about the medals table, or so I hope.
You were the UK's Minister for the Olympics in the build-up to the 2012 Games, an outstanding Games. But whichever way you look at it, it was a huge, huge success. What's the secret then of a successful game? Share it with us, and I'm sure you've shared it with Tokyo ahead of the Games. And can that city deliver the kind of immense success that London was in the midst of a pandemic?
Yes, of course it can. The Tokyo Games will be a different sort of Games to London, but then they always were going to be a different sort of Games to London. I mean, the passage of 8 years these days is quite a long time in terms of technological development, in terms of athletes sort of life cycles and so on and so forth. There won't be that many people in Team GB, I'm just trying to think of the exact number, who would have competed in London. So it's a fresh set of athletes. If you asked me what is the great trick in organising terms about Olympic Games, it's going to sound a really silly answer, but it's sport. And what you tend to forget when you're organising the Games, you're worrying about the myriad of things, the 205 nations that are sending athletes, that keeping them secure and so on and so forth. And you forget that the moment the sport starts, all those administrative, all those organisational worries fall away, and everybody concentrates on the performance of the athletes. And that is, of course, the way it ought to be. You want to cut the sport, the space, to allow it to speak for itself, and that is the most important thing. And what made London a great Games was the sport, and what will make Tokyo a great Games is the sport as well.
I think the opening ceremony was pretty good as well, to be honest, but there you are.
But the opening ceremony is to be got through. I mean, I hate to say that. I'm very pleased we did it very well in London. You don't want, as an organising committee, as a host government, you don't want that to go wrong. But actually, the moment when we really felt that London, we were all delighted the opening ceremony went so well. But the moment the Games started to have a rhythm, a cadence, a feel of their own, was when the sport got going, and that's the really important thing to remember, I think.
Do you think there will be any long-term impact of the pandemic on future games?
I hope not, is the short answer. I mean, all Olympic Games are different because they're infused with the national characteristics of the country that hosts them. You know, clearly the games that Japan was hoping to lay on a year ago before the global pandemic struck, you know, would have been different games to the ones that it will lay on now. That's not going to stop them being excellent games in a different way or a fantastic success. And incidentally, I'm absolutely convinced and sure that the Tokyo Games will be a great success. Paris will put down its own marker in 2024, Los Angeles in 2028. It really is up to those host cities to brand, to run a games in a way that speaks to what they're trying to achieve. So all Olympic Games are different. And personally, I think that's what makes them such great experiences. This is my fourth, and I've enjoyed them all. They've all been very different.
And lastly, what events in particular are you personally looking forward to?
Well, I always try and dodge that question, actually, because all athletes...
Well, try not to dodge it this time.
Should be treated this time. I mean, I was a hockey player, so I always enjoy watching hockey. I've just completed a year of heading up a review looking at the governance of world rugby. So I'll have half an eye on the rugby sevens. The honest answer to your question is that I'm going to have a very full set of eyes on any event where British athletes are competing, and particularly those where they've got a medal hope. And then I'll just be enjoying the fun of being back in an Olympic environment, being back in Tokyo, and looking forward just to being back in the Olympic Games environment.
Can I declare an interest now and say, if you ever need a media consultant as far as rugby is concerned, I'm your man.
Of course you can. Actually, when you're doing governance reviews and looking at the organisation of sports, one of the key tricks, particularly if you're doing it over a year, is to keep right out of the media.
Fair enough. Well,
but point taken, yeah.
Hugh Robertson, many thanks indeed for joining us on The Agenda.
My pleasure.
Was there ever a more jinxed event than the Tokyo Olympic Games? Well, opinion polls had showed that about 80% of the Japanese public wanted the Games to be cancelled or postponed again. But then, with just a few days to go before the opening ceremony, Tokyo announced a state of emergency, and fans were banned completely. Well, the no-fan atmosphere will include the opening ceremony at the $1.5 billion National Stadium, built specifically for this, and it's traditionally the most watched event during the Olympics. But despite all that, the Olympics is going ahead, and athletes are getting ready for their jabs and masks to take part in what is the biggest sports jamboree in the world. It's also turned the Olympics now into a made-for-television event, in that decision pushed by the Japanese government and supported by the International Olympic Committee. But the world does need athletics. It is, after all, the purest sport. Lots of countries can't row or sail or do equestrianism, tennis or golf, but anyone, anywhere can run, jump and throw. Everybody knows there is a risk, and it is also a massive ask to carry out daily testing of every athlete. The truth was that athletics needs the Olympics to happen, and that's why even the great Olympian, Sebastian Coe, pushed so hard for the Games to go ahead. The world wants to see great sport and worthy champions, but everyone watching their televisions will also want to see athletes, having been jabbed and masked, still living up to the Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius. And that means faster, higher and stronger. Don't forget, you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, life after lockdown. What does the future really hold post-pandemic? But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.